Welcome to this episode of Talking Transformation, an Australian Transformation and Turnaround Association initiative. We hope you enjoy the varied conversations and experiences shared by our industry transformation and turnaround leaders. If you'd like to know more about AusTTA, you can visit our website at austtta.org. I'm the series host, Jackie O'Dowd. Hello. In this episode, I'm joined by co-host Darryl Carr, and today we're talking with Dave Snowden, who's founder and chief scientific officer for Cognitive Edge, and he's also a world expert in knowledge management, and who's also famous for creating the Cynefin framework. And the Cynefin framework's an approach that can help organisations and leadership teams to better manage complexity and chaos. And both of those can be experienced when organisations embark on transformation or turnaround initiatives. So I'm sure you can relate to them. So Dave, welcome to Talking Transformation. And thank you for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
So Darryl, over to you for your first question.
Thanks. So yes, welcome David. I appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. Just an easy one to start. As we all know, modern organisations are full of complexity. What's more, they're subject to an unknown set of challenges from a variety of fronts, some known, some unknown. With your experience, how do you think enterprises should approach the process of decision-making in order to transform the way they operate?
Probably the most important thing is to realise there isn't a single model of decision-making. And also to realise that a large amount of what goes in an organisation remains ordered and structured. And there's no need to abandon sort of traditional methods and tools in that context. I think when you're under conditions of complexity, there are two or three things which really matter. One is something which takes about 6 months to a year to get into place, which is you need dense informal networks. And in complexity terms, an informal network is a context-free communication channel. So if you look in Singapore as an example, everybody in the Singapore government does a period of military service. And so because of that, they build relationships in the officers' mess, the sergeants' mess by going on exercise together. And those persist into government. So it's kind of like a meritocratic distributed network of connections that people can fall back to. Whereas in Britain, regrettably, all right, the informal networks come from 3 private schools and 2 elite universities. And those networks are more perverse in terms of their consequence. So building informal networks across silos is really important. And in COVID, I mean, I've interviewed over 100 C-level executives. It was the informal networks they fell back to, not the formal systems, because formal systems are designed as context-specific information flow, and in a crisis, you need something which is context-free. So there's a body of methods around that. I think the second key thing is you need to distribute situational assessment. So the use of whole of workforce assessment of a current situation is key before you make a decision. And that's easy to do in real time. It's one of the major areas of our work. And the reason for that is based in a simple experiment, which has been repeated in different forms by many people. If you take a group of radiologists and ask them to look at a batch of x-rays for anomalies, and on the final x-ray, you put a picture of a gorilla, which is 48 times the size of a cancer nodule in plain view, on average, 83% of radiologists will not see it, and the 17% who do come to believe they were wrong when they talk with the 83%. So using what we call human sensor networks in real time, and I mean real time, I mean now, not waiting for 2 or 3 days, not only gives you an idea of what the dispositional state of your employees is to virtually anything, but it also finds the 17%, the people who've seen something that other people haven't seen before they talk to everybody else. And there's other things as well, but those are probably the 2 most important.
So as an organisation is going through, say, a turnaround rather than transformation, and it's got elements of complication and complexity and even probably an element of chaos in it. In your experience, when you've helped organisations and groups understand complexity, what can you share with them to help them recover from difficult circumstances?
I've given one to some extent in the last answer, right?
Yeah.
Because there's a famous statement from Hewlett-Packard, which everybody quotes and is still true, which is, if only Hewlett-Packard knew what Hewlett-Packard knew. I mean, I once created a matrix which had known, unknown, unknowables, and presented it in the Pentagon one day, and then decided 4 weeks later I couldn't use it for a bit because aspects of it have been misused, all right? But one of the key things to understand is that your main danger is the unknown knowns. So the things that you know, but you don't know in the center. So one of the things is that ability to identify the 17% out there. There are solutions, but middle management tends to filter them, and not because middle management are evil, it's just the nature of the system that you get filtering. In complexity, this is called disintermediation. So you need to remove the mediating layers between the decision maker and the raw data, whether that's a programmer writing code. So the system's design is actually a mistake. The programmers want access to raw anecdotal data from users, or an executive making a decision where you need to be able to go directly, for example, to customer stories without people interpreting them before you come to them. So that sort of disintermediation is a key thing. I think the other thing is kind of like, and this is where the Canavian framework comes in. One of the things I'm quite proud of is a American police case where a SWAT team literally drew the Canavian framework with the end of a gun on a concrete block, and then had a conversation and decided the problem was complex, not complicated. So they couldn't follow standard operating procedures. And they did parallel experimental probes to see what the gunman would do. And that gave them a course of action, so they could actually, lives were saved. But the really important thing is they phoned up head office and said, it's complex, we're probing. And because they used the framework strategically as well as operationally, the language was immediately understood and their actions were supported. So that use of a common meta language across levels of the organization, and that distinction between, can we apply good practice, best practice, emergent practice, whatever, that ability to say it's one of these, or it's like this, or it's moving between these things, or it's ambiguous, it's liminal between those states, allows you to very quickly and more efficiently determine the right form of decision making.
So if an organization is using some sort of knowledge management framework, and they're really the knowns, it's what we know, it's the knowledge we've got available to ourselves, how do we apply that knowledge management framework? How do we make it more practical to bring in some of those unknowns or things that we need to consider?
I'd be very dubious about knowledge management frameworks anyway, right? There's a famous, Polanyi famously said, and Polanyi's where most people get material from on this. Polanyi famously said, we always know more than we can say. I extended that to say we always know more than we can say. We can always say more than we can write down. And the danger is knowledge management systems are focused on material which can be written down. And that's about 10% of what we know. There's also the sort of knowledge which comes through apprenticeship, through serving time. The knowledge which can't be written down because you just know what to do, right? And anybody else with the same experience knows what to do.
Knows what to do.
I was walking in the Lake District this weekend, and we had an incident up on Scarfield Pike with the tourists, and 3 or 4 of us who had been walking all our lives just knew what to do without having to think about it, whereas everybody else was faffing around, right? And there's this interesting intermediary stage of what we call narrative knowledge, and it's quite interesting. The first projects on these were done in Australia, actually, with Lend-Lease, and it starts with civil engineers. Engineers tend to hold knowledge in narrative form, not in structured form. I mean, they do both, but the really valuable stuff is in stories, and particularly stories of failure, because, it's like fairy stories for humans. We tell stories of failure, not success, because that knowledge is about learning, so that has more learning capacity. So I think the recognition of narrative and experience is key. I think the other thing, and this is another part of the EU Field Guide, which I wrote recently, is you need to store knowledge at a fine level of granularity using abstract metadata, not concrete metadata. And the trouble is people use AI, well, machine learning type algorithms on text, which is very limited because the training data sets represent past knowledge, not future needs. That gets rid of we build narrative databases for companies, and the databases are full of worst practice and bad examples and fictional, because actually project managers speculating on how things could have gone wrong actually provides you better knowledge than trying to find out what actually happened. And that's a historical fact. So, and the other big thing, if you store knowledge at a fine level of granularity, you don't put it into taxonomies. Taxonomies are the doom of knowledge management. It rhymes with taxidermy and it produces the same result. Yeah. You need to be able to rapidly associate things you already know with unarticulated or unanticipated needs. So a proper knowledge management framework allows that. In Cynefin, it's called exaptive learning. And that comes from evolutionary biology. So, dinosaurs' feathers evolved for warmth and sexual display. But then you get very fast running dinosaurs with extended skin flaps to better display their feathers, and they run fast, they glide. So flight is exaptive, not adaptive, a trait which evolved for one function under stress evolves for something else. Yeah. A Raytheon engineer maintaining the magneto of a radar machine in 1945 realized the significance of the fact that chocolate bar was melted in his pocket. So he put a metal box around the magneto, we got microwave ovens. So storing knowledge so you can provide exaptive insights in the moment of need is actually also key.
Yeah. I've just done some work with an organization that had a knowledge framework in place and tried to codify everything. But most of the knowledge actually came from the engineers that had recently retired and brought back, like you said, the stories about why the whole cover was a certain size. You couldn't pick that up from engineering drawings. And they just said, look, there's no engineering reason why that whole cover was of that material and of that size. We did it because on the day it was the only one we had.
I remember I was in the crisis centre for Thames Water, and they had a fish kill incident in the Mole. So this is Jane Austen territory. And by sheer luck, somebody they just actually forced into early retirement was around. And he said, oh, isn't there a Second World War arsenic plant up in that hill somewhere? And that had leaked. Yeah. Now, that knowledge, technically, with the benefit of hindsight, could have been on a map. But the point is, it wasn't. And it turned out he only knew that because he liked on the weekend to walk around Second World War industrial sites. And he happened to be an engineer. And if you look at my work in counterterrorism, virtually every terrorist incident which has been successfully deployed, there was luck or coincidence involved. Yeah. And I think one of the things we talk about in knowledge management, this fine-grained knowledge and the use of experience, is you need to manage for serendipity. You need to manage for luck. And that's something which organizations need to start to think about very consciously, because you can create an ecosystem in which luck is more likely to come to your rescue. I'll give you another example of that. One of the things we do when we start knowledge management with a company is we use senior people or consultants or other arrogant groups. We send them an apprentice to keep their journal for them, which makes them feel good. But interestingly, they tell the apprentice things they'd never tell consultants. So it's a good intelligence operation. And from that, we produce maps of decisions and information flows between them based on what actually happens over, say, 3 or 4 weeks. And to be honest, when you do them, or even with optimization software, they look like a spider's web early in the morning. After a herd of walkers have already walked down the path and it was raining with dew on it. It's that sort of messy stuff, yeah? And every time we put that up on one wall and we put the process map on the other wall. And we send executives in and we say, that's what you think happens. That's what actually happens. Now talk about it. All right. And that difference between the ostensive and the real is actually a really important one. Yeah, that needs to be mapped quite early on in the process. I remember talking about this with Peter Drucker because I taught leadership with him, which was a huge privilege. And if you actually look at Tayloristic models, they have a high level of apprenticeship in management. Yeah, the assumption is you'll serve an apprenticeship, you'll work with people, you'll be in the office, you'll have conversations. Yeah. What happened in the 80s and 90s is an attempt to remove human judgment from the process. And you see it big time initially with business process reengineering. Hammer and Chamfrey famously, this is the book, two big books launched systems thinking. One was Hammer and Chamfrey Reengineering the Corporation, and the other was Peter Senge Learning Organization. Yeah. Now, both of those assume that the leaders provide direction and everybody else falls in line. And business process reengineering in particular, well, Senge says it very clearly. I think it's page 4 or 5. The leaders set direction and everybody else subsumes their individual needs and the overall goals of the organization. It's quite an appalling statement in my point of view, both practically because it destroys diversity and ideologically because it's culturally determined. Hammer and Chamfrey say nothing that has happened in the past has any relevance to the future. And the assumption was human judgment wasn't needed in the system. Everything was to be automated. And that's carried on since. There's a famous film, All Looked After by Machines of Loving Grace, which people should look at, right? Because AI is actually, it will never outthink humans, but it will outreact. And I think that's a distinction people need to understand. It's why it's really dangerous in warfare, but it's even more dangerous in business decision making, because everything is automated based on the training data sets. The training data sets are insufficient. Now, I'm not against AI. Part of what we originally developed SenseMaker for was to create better training data sets, which incorporated epistemic justice. I was arguing 20 years ago that AI was going to be based on training data sets, which reinforced existing privileges and existing practice. And if you look at the Scholastic Parrots paper from the Google employees, you can see that that prophecy was quite true. So I think the key thing is to think about augmentation of human intelligence, not data-driven decisions. And it's like, I had it, I'll give an illustration, all right? You can use data-driven decisions for things in the center of a normal distribution because they don't change. But your real issue is things in the tails of a Pareto distribution. All right, and these days it's called fat tails. All right, so a normal distribution doesn't have fat tails, so you can ignore outliers. A Pareto distribution has fat tails, so outliers are significant. So I was shopping in Waitrose the other day, right, which shows which part of England I live in, and all that sort of stuff, where there's jokes about Waitrose shoppers and websites. It's how many different types of olives should you take to university with you is one of the jokes, right? And I've used their app, which is really good. So I scan the app, all right, start, go around, do all the things. When I come to the checkout, I can't check out. It won't recognize the barcode. Now, there's no way around that. I'm sat there with what I should pay on the iPhone, and we ended up having to recheck everything in. I then notify them, and they can't cope with this because it's an outlier event, so they haven't got a process for it. So their latest advice is I should get a new Waitrose card and create and reinstall the app with that new Waitrose card number, because of course my Waitrose card is now blocked because I didn't pay for the goods I scanned, and then phone them up and they'll transfer the account.
We're at a little bit of a change of tack here, David. I wanted to sort of highlight something that you put out into the ether a couple of weeks ago about the frustration of people taking your thoughts and material and repacking it as simplistic solutions to complex problems. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, and also the dangers of looking for easy answers.
Yeah, people keep asking me to name names, and I'm getting pretty close to doing it, to be honest. I think, it's good and bad news, right? So the last year and a half, all of a sudden, I've had this sort of coterie of what I call cybernetics fanboys, right? And I think the reason is we are entering what Einstein called the age of complexity. So complexity theory has gone from being a sort of esoteric idea into it's starting to become mainframe. Basically, it's had 20, 30 years and it hasn't produced results. In government, for example, all they do is have a workshop and agree how things should be and write a paper about it. And it sounds wonderful. And governments love doing that because then they don't have to do anything. There's this general government belief if we've written a paper about it and said what should happen, the problem's gone away, all right, which is one of the problems we got with global warming. So the fact that they started to attack, so every time we mention complexity, they jump on it and they'd say, but second order cybernetics already did this. We've been addressing these problems for years. Yeah. And you say, yeah, but hang on, guys, all right? Human beings used gravity for centuries before Newton came along. But after we had the science, it transforms the way we do it. And they haven't got that yet because complexity is science-based. It's not, it's not a social science, it's a natural science, in that sense. So what then happens is people want to be on the next wave. And that's when things are really dangerous. Because during those changes, it's like, if you look at it historically, Microsoft beats IBM on PC software. And actually it was worse software, but it dominated the market faster and so on. All right. So it's first, during times of discontinuous change, there's a whole strategy model around this called flexuous curves for people who are interested. Work I did with Clayton Christian and others. During times of discontinuous change, first mover advantage is key. Once you go through the first mover period, second mover advantage gives you a different space in the ecosystem. Yeah. So what you've got is a lot of people starting to jump on the bandwagon. And they don't understand it, to be quite honest. I caught somebody the other day who'd obviously read the Wikipedia entry on complexity, which, by the way, is disastrous. And they just badged it up into a service. Or, they basically put, new wine into old wineskins, to quote the Bible, right? So they just take what they've been doing for years. There's a couple in Australia who are really bad at this, right? For years, they've been doing organizational transformation and change using a whole body of methods which involve agreeing goals, common visions, strategy, etc. And they've just rebadged that stuff with complexity language. So it's a good sign and it's a danger, And it's why I make a very strong statement. What we're actually about is what we call naturalizing sense making. With a hyphen. Because you need people to ask you a question about what you mean, not make assumptions.
So Dave, talking about how people take your work, other people's work, different theories and bring them together and adapt them to create new services or products. What are your thoughts on adaptability and how your work particularly can help transformation and turnaround practitioners get better value, drive better value for the organisations that they're trying to help?
I think that there's a key phrase in complexity science we use a lot, right? It's a standard response to somebody who asks for a universal. You say you're asking a context-free question in a context-specific world. And I think that question of context is key. And the danger with most of the big consultancy solutions is they're context-free solutions. Here's the solution, roll it out, it applies to everything. So there was nothing wrong with business process re-engineering, provided you confined it to core manufacturing. There was everything wrong with it when you applied it to customer relationships. And then there were kind of like two reactions. One was to say, okay, we understand its limits, we can do something else here. The other was to create what Gary Klein famously calls Six Sigma. I really like that, Six Sigma, right? Which is, let's just do it harder and faster with more money and it might work this time, right? So one of the key things for me is multi-vendor, multi-method. So one of the things we're actually launching at the moment under a separate brand, because we want to contribute to this. We're creating a scaffolding or an infrastructure, but we won't own that, is a method by which organizations can assemble methods and tools from different vendors into projects. All right. So we got a sort of base infrastructure, and then we'll put our methods and tools will be one pack, but other vendors will have their own packs within that system. So instead of saying, I have adopted X, you can say, well, I'm taking this method or this tool and it produces this output. So that output would flow into this method. And we're bringing that out as a facilitation kit and a process and everything else. So multi-vendor, multi-tools is key. I think the other key thing is, again, this is a key complexity message. You manage the evolutionary potential of the present and you stop talking about the future. And this is the most difficult thing for change practitioners, because they're so into having workshops with the executives and agreeing how life will be wonderful in 5 years' time or 3 years' time. It amazes me that Western corporations have adopted the planning cycle and behavioral characteristics of Stalinist Russia, but never mind. Yeah, and having defined that, we have the 3-year plan or the 5-year plan to achieve it, and then miraculously we go away, and then 3 years later it's completely failed, so the consultants come in and repeat. Yeah, yep. Rinse and repeat, as they say. So I think this concept of the most critical thing in any transformation program is map where the hell you are at the moment. And also map attitudes, because staff attitudes are lead indicators, whereas compliance is a lag indicator. Yeah, so that's kind of like rule number 1. With that, you start to nudge the system. And by the way, I'm not advocating behavioral economics at the moment. That's deeply manipulative. Yeah, we actually develop methods and tools by which people can see what the next stepping stone is. I call this the Frozen 2 complexity strategy. If you ever watched Frozen 2?
No.
Okay, well, the sister hasn't got magic, who to my mind is the real heroine of the whole bloody film, right? It's a great complex. But at one point, she thinks, do the next right thing. Yeah, it's actually a wonderful song. And that's what complexity is about, is what's the next right thing? Do that, look again, do the next right thing. And the next right thing for the board may be different from, to come back to a pre-thinker, to your branch office in Toowoomba. All right, maybe completely different from Melbourne. So what the next right thing is deeply contextual. So yeah, one key thing on complexity is where are people? What do they think? What is possible next? Yeah, so that the system will align even though people start off in different directions. That's kind of like one key principle. I think one of the other things is you need to be in a position where you're open to possibilities as the journey starts. So the other thing we say in complexity is you start journeys with a general sense of direction. You don't have goals.
Yeah.
Because you live in a world which is inherently uncertain and is becoming more uncertain. So if you start a journey and you constantly scan, and remember I talked about whole of workforce engagement, then you can change direction as you start the travel. If you have goals, you don't. And the third, and this is a fundamental rule, is never, ever give a mission statement, a purpose statement, or a value statement. Because all you've done is to tell people what language to use. And now the people who play the corporate game, and most survivors will do that, yeah, they'll just change their slides. I had this with shall we say, an extremely senior IBM team, right? Actually, it was the bloody board, right? And I was asked what I thought about the IBM went from this to on demand. It was a new brand change. Yeah, it was linked with a new chief executive officer. I don't know what it is about new chief executive officers. I think it's like dogs pissing on trees. They have to rebrand to, establish their scent traces. So they'd done this and they said, what did I think about it from a complexity perspective? And I got really angry. You should never upset the Celts. We're prepared to suicide if we get angry enough, right? And it was funny because I'd worked on this. It was part of one of my projects, and it was obvious my boss's boss hadn't even mentioned I'd been involved in this bloody work, which I've been spent days with Ogilvy and Mather, which is a punishment in its own right, right? And so in anger, I said, well, I think it's a brilliant way of finding out who you fire in your first 6 months of office. And there was this silence around the table. And somebody said, what do you mean by that, buddy? I've learned this in the States. If anybody adds buddy to the end of a question, it's kind of like, it's like a rattlesnake, waving its tail. It's like a warning sign. And I said, well, anybody who's changed their business plan or their slide presentation from to on demand in less than 6 months is obviously a sycophant, because they're not actually changing what they do. They're just using find and replace. Yeah. The trouble is everybody around the table had done exactly that. And 3 of them just burst out laughing, and they were good friends after that because it was the game, right? Companies with real values actually don't need to say what they are because they're lived experiences. And values and purpose comes through in the micro narratives of people's day-to-day existence. The minute you write it down, you've got problems. Yeah, because now you will never know what people are saying or doing. And it's this terrible, terrible desire to make everything explicit, which has overwhelmed the consultancy industry. And a lot of things actually don't need to be said. I mean, I did a lot of my initial work on knowledge management came from work I did in Kakadu in the 70s. when I was working on Indigenous land rights, which was shall we say, a formative experience. But one of the things about, and this is the key thing, I've done a lot of work with Indigenous people ever since. And one of the key things is there's a problem with Northern Europe and North America, and Australia gets subsumed into that by definition of colonialism. They want to talk before they act. Indigenous communities act and then have conversations. And we're actually doing work on peace and reconciliation at the moment in the States, based on work I did in Northern Ireland in the 70s, by which we're finding common stories between people who are at war and then getting them to actually work on those common problems together and allow the conversation about their differences to emerge as they work together and discover what they've got in common. And the whole of the peace and reconciliation in the industry in the States hates my guts over this, because they want everybody to come to a workshop and be told how if they were all white males with degrees from MIT with a Western culture, the world would be a better place. Yeah, and, have U diagrams and all this sort of stuff. And all of that stuff is actually quite dangerous because it doesn't allow any authentic voice to come through. And if you're a genuine change practitioner, you need to constantly think about authenticity of change. Yeah, not just the sort of explicit nature.
Yeah, I think you're right about the values piece. When you go into organizations and they've got their purpose, their mission, and their values all put up as artwork on their wall, it just sets red flags for me, because it just means their hiring practices are somewhat hit and miss, and they don't actually know what they're hiring for.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the things we're just working on at the moment, which you've reminded me I've got to write up later today, is mapping culture for CV selection. Because at the moment, coming back to an earlier question, it's one of those dangers is people are now using algorithms to choose CVs. And if you don't know it, there are algorithms which will improve your CV so it's more likely to be chosen. Yeah, and we actually know culture is actually more important than qualifications. So this is where we're working with people like Gaping Void. So we present 8 or 9 cartoons. And this is semiotics, by the way, as a technical name for it. And abstractions are really important to human sense making. We love cartoons because they express knowledge much better than written text. Yeah, it's why they go viral. So we present, say, 6 cartoons. You choose the cartoon which represents the culture of your company. You write an illustrative anecdote about why you chose it. You index that. And from that, we draw what's called a fitness landscape or a map. Yeah. And that maps your culture, and it maps it quantitatively, but with illustrative stories. And you can also see which cartoon people chose in which group. That's actually useful in its own right. But then somebody comes onto your website and they choose a cartoon, they index it, they tell a story, and then you match. And if you want to carry on with similar people, you choose the people who match the culture of the group. And if you want to disrupt it, you see where you go with this.
Yeah.
So you use technology and data to augment human decision making, but you allow that human element within the system. And that concept of abstraction, of semiotics, of aesthetics is actually really important for human sense making. If you don't know it, sorry, throwing in random facts, art comes before language in human evolution. And it's key to invention. So art allows you to go up a level of abstraction so you see novelty. And again, AI doesn't do that.
Yeah. It's a good point. Might just sort of slightly go off script here, just to frustrate Jackie, but I was just wondering while you were talking earlier about some of the sort of behaviours around change management and the behaviour of executives. I was thinking how this sort of could assist with problems that I observe around what's been called short-termism, so the tendency to only do 90-day plans and not think about the consequences down the line. What's your experience in handling those sorts of conversations?
I think that's a real problem. I mean, we had executives in IBM, and they hop between jobs. So they take a business over, they rape and pillage it. Yeah? And lots of corporations have got that. It's actually the motivation behind things like SAFE, which is an agile method. in that by the time you've implemented, you'll have moved on to your next job. And executives love that. I have launched this major initiative, which in 2 years' time will, then they move on and let some other poor bastard take the consequences, right? So I think that that's kind of like a real problem in organizations. But short-termism is okay if you've got scaffolding and sense of direction right. I mean, the trouble with a 3-year plan or a 9-month plan is problematic. So you need to do these short-term things, but we're talking a lot at the moment. This is kind of like something which is a paper in review on at the moment, but we'll launch it shortly. Based on constructor theory and physics, which is where I got the idea, in that you start off by defining the counterfactual universe in terms of constraints. So what is not possible? And you map why it isn't possible, because you might be able to change that. And then within the range of what isn't possible, you create what are called constructors, which produce repeatable effects in parallel, and you see what works. Yeah? Now, that allows you to mix short-term with long-term, because your long-term decision-making is on the counterfactual space. Yeah? And your short-term decision-making is on the constructors. So that to me is really important. And that's, Cynefin will actually change its language. And Cynefin has changed its language a lot in 20 years. This will change the language of constraints to scaffolding. And scaffolding is important. Yeah, if you want flexibility, you have an endoskeleton. Yeah, if you don't want flexibility, you have an exoskeleton. And then the boundaries are defined and so on. So we're building that on a metaphorical basis. Right? But the other problem is the way the market drives people, and the same is true in government. So because you're constantly driven, if you look at it, the really innovative companies own their own shares or ignore the market. I mean, Richard Branson bought his shares back when he went public because it was destroying his capacity to innovate. Apple just ignores the market. Yeah. So if you follow the market, you're into short-termism, and that's also the problem. Let's take climate change, right? Is you can't blame politicians for not making long-term decisions if they're not going to be elected. Yeah, because of short-termism. So one of the big initiatives we started and we're building now is you've got to make climate change an empathetic construct at a local level for people to understand it. It can't be understood at a national or international level. And actually the last big announcement for the Glasgow conference was disastrous because most people, including very intelligent people, said, okay, we're doomed. So we might as well have fun while we can before we all burn. Right? Now, that's actually the wrong strategy from a complexity point of view. And this really frustrates the hell out of me at the moment because actually I used to worry about my grandchildren and my children, now I worry about me, right? In complexity in a crisis, your first level of action is to increase your options, not to come up with a solution. And everybody's trying to get everybody to agree, carbon targets. And yeah, we need to do that, but it's going to take a long time to get consensus around it. What we should be focused on at the moment is, things like, our former chief scientist is heavily into this. The science of how to refreeze the poles is known. It's now an engineering problem. And engineering problems can be solved, right? So we need to start to do the short-term things which give us more time. Yeah, and that applies to a corporation as well. Your main, say this in the EU handbook. Yeah, as you get up the ladder, I've been C-level, right? The higher you get up the ladder, the fewer decisions you can actually make, and the more you only meet angry customers. Right? This is the nature of promotion, right? So the key principle is you distribute decision-making, but you centralize coordination. Now that means you need to create trusted mechanisms for distributed decision-making. We do that, for example, with what are called entangled trios. So any function has 3 diverse people. If those 3 people agree, the decision is made. And then the trios overlap, so the system communicates horizontally without the need for intervention. The only time you make an intervention as a senior leader is to create options or to create constraints. Now, if you look at what Jacinda did in New Zealand at the start of COVID, she broke the law to lock down New Zealand. Right? That gave her far more options. Whereas the UK, Sweden waited till they had no choice, by which time their option space was radically reduced. So this concept of options and strategic decision-making is key. Yeah. And the other reason, by the way, as a senior leader is do not make decisions in a crisis because at least 50% of them will be wrong. And then people will lose confidence in you. Yeah, so that distributed decision making is key.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Dave. It's somewhat reminiscent of some conversations I've had with organisations here where I've taken the approach of providing them with some guardrails and then given them the autonomy and the tools to be able to make decisions to find their way down that path, which I think is certainly more successful in terms of them taking ownership of what needs to be done. So I just wanted to I suppose say thank you from my perspective. We're getting close to the time on this, but just before we finish, I just thought I'd ask, where would you recommend listeners go to find out more about you, about Cognitive Edge, and the Cynefin framework, of course?
There's our website. Yeah. We've now created a thing called the Cynefin Centre, which is the research and development arm, and that focuses also on government not-for-profit. That has a branch in Australia, which is being set up at the moment. Yeah. So Cognitive Edge, the Cynefin Centre, that's where the material is. Most of what I write is on the blog, although we've got to convert that into books, and I'm trying to get the space to work on that at the moment, because we produced the field guide with the European Commission. And actually, that's really important for complexity. Nobody gets fired for buying IBM was an adage, and now it's nobody gets fired for implementing McKinsey's report. The main reason people won't work with consultants who they know are good is that if it goes wrong, you'll be blamed if it's a small consultancy. Yeah. So the EU field guide gives you top cover. It's kind of like we're implementing the field guide. The field guide is based on the Cynefin framework. So that's actually quite important for complexity practitioners and smaller consultancy firms. So that's one source of it. The other thing, and I said this last night on a call. So last night I finished at 11 o'clock with a whiskey, and this morning I start at 7 a.m. with a coffee. So that's life, right? Is just for God's sake, read, and don't read the popular management books. I've yet to see a popular management book on complexity which isn't a travesty of the subject. And I am going to publish my list of the 10 worst books on complexity shortly. Yeah, because I'm quite enjoying putting that together, right? Because the field isn't advanced enough yet for people to write a popular book on what is a deeply scientific subject. I mean, I've got 3 books on the planet at the moment. One is about Cynefin, one is about narrative. So there are aspects of it which can be codified in a relatively easy to understand form. But these days, you really want to be reading stuff on, biology is going through the same sort of transformation that physics went through in the 40s. Things like epigenetics have implications for executives today. We know the mechanism by which culture is biologically inherited. And we know the biological impact of stress at work. So there's stuff in that area. There's things like constructor theory in physics. There's a whole body of stuff around assemblage theory, which is transforming health provision. Yeah, affordances in biology. There are a whole series of topics and subjects, and there's accessible scientific literature. So I would say read the science and stop reading books which confuse correlation with causation. So the minute I pick up a book and it says, we did extensive research by interviewing executives in 20 companies, you think, oh my God, here we go again, all right? There's some really bad books there. I'll give you 2 illustrations, I might as well for controversy. One is Lean Startup, which is kind of like a really popular one. And the guy only studies success. He's gone down exactly the same route as Good to Great, in that the guy only studies positive cases. He doesn't study the negative cases. And if you look at Lean Startup, he interviewed, venture capitalists, entrepreneurs who succeeded. Now, we worked with Dorothy Leonard at Harvard on this, and we interviewed people who failed. They did all the same things as the people who succeeded. The point is, what you've got is a huge number, so some of them are bound to succeed anyway, and that's just basic knowledge. And then probably the worst is Lacroix's Reinventing the Organization, which is based on, Nora Bates and I are having a good fun at the moment, savaging stage theories, because they're just bad science, right? So this is kind of like you want to become a jade organization. It's bad enough when we had turquoise and coral, but now we've got jade. So you keep getting these levels of enlightenment by which the reason you don't understand me is you haven't reached my stage of enlightenment. And that book actually selects aspects of cases to support an ideological approach. It doesn't even report the cases accurately. but those books best sell. Because what people want is a simplistic solution. They want lots of cases to illustrate it. They never check the facts. And if you're a senior executive, you shouldn't be accepting anything without double checking the facts.
Yeah. But I think there's a lot of authors that have put materials together. Some consultants, they have a hypothesis and then try and meet it, or they've got a theory and try and substantiate it. I wholeheartedly agree. You know, there are organizations that are really successful and there are those organizations that fail. And in the main, they do the same things. There'll be a number of small things that stops them being successful, but it's understanding what those small things are.
It's funny, really. I mean, my first degree is physics and philosophy. Now, I did that because my father was a veterinary surgeon. And if, as you hit puberty, you're forced to do sheath washings on a bull on a freezing cold February morning and being laughed at by Welsh farmers, you decide theoretical physics and philosophy is your future, right? So that's the way. But it's actually quite interesting because both degrees were hugely useful. So one of the things physics teaches you is that no social scientist ever has enough data to form a valid conclusion. And if you look at the way, for example, Piaget's work on childhood development has been savaged because people couldn't repeat the experiments. A huge amount of psychology has been destroyed because people have gone back and said, well, let's go and repeat the experiment and see what happens, right? And from a philosophical point of view, well, we'll get into logic and things like that. And I think one of the things Australia used to do brilliantly, and there was a wonderful philosophy podcast, and the guy died prematurely. I forgot what it was called. I met him through Phil Adams, who also is brilliant. So basically, Australia used to teach philosophy to primary schools. And it was very popular. And then for some reason they stopped. But it's like when I went to school, we were taught rhetoric. So every week from the age of 11, I had to walk to the front of a class on Friday and I was given a card and I had to speak for 7 minutes without preparation on the subject on a side. The first one I got is you support capital punishment. And that was when my mother was active in the campaign to abolish it, which is why the teacher chose it. It was quite deliberate, all right? Fortunately, there weren't recordings, all right? Otherwise, I'd have been in real trouble. We did that every week from 11 to 18. Now, that's the sort of thing we need to do in schools. We need to teach people, because one of the things about rhetoric is it teaches you to understand the validity of arguments by the process of doing it, not by just doing a couple of classes. And I think that's what we need. And I think retrospectively, organizations would do a lot better to do some basic courses in rhetoric and argument and debating, and evidence gathering rather than a lot of the things they actually do, because most corporations, run training is here's a method, learn how to use the method. And you need to do more than that. Particularly, I think, I worked with Lou Gerstner on leadership development in IBM, and he had this top 200. This is the thing which, by the way, finally killed me in IBM. I made so many enemies. So the top 200, every year 30 joined and 30 left. And one of the things he said up front was, most of you won't succeed because so far you've succeeded by being selfish. Now you've got to achieve your numbers, but you've got to collaborate. Right? And that's what the course was about. And my job was to do disruption. Unfortunately, Lou left halfway through the first, and Joel never forgave me, right? And one of the things we did there, which was fascinating, sorry, I'm getting stories, is we gathered stories from their employees about all the leaders and positioned them on Carnarvon. And then we got the leaders to actually index stories about people like Hitler and Stalin and Roosevelt and Genghis Khan. And then we showed them which great leaders of the past, good and bad, were indexed by them the way their employees index stories about them. And that was fascinating, right? And that's where Joel never forgave me, because he came out as Stalin and Hitler and nothing else. And he decided that was my fault. And, proceeded to tear me apart and threatened to have me fired, disemboldened, sent to a concentration camp. And everybody's pointing out, well, don't you see what you're doing here, right? But that process, and this is a key thing, I think, for leaders, is you have to be aware. And you can't trust what people tell you. I mean, I remember working with CEO of SmithKline Beecham, We created the Jan Lechley when he was there. He was a brilliant guy, ex-tennis player. We created a virtual environment in which he could do what medieval kings did, which is once a year go and sit in a tavern and listen. Right? And that ability to see yourself as other people see you is key for leadership, and not many people can cope with it.
What about getting leaders to listen?
They don't have time. I keep trying to explain this to people, right? I mean, when I was C-level, right, you set your table, 5 groups of people would come in, all of whom have spent their lives studying a subject and the last 3 weeks researching something, and they've all got propositions. You've got 3 minutes to make a decision, right? So I think that's where it's not leaders listening, it's creating processes by which leaders can discover what the right thing is. So one of the things we say there is, if you've got 5 coherent ideas, give them each a small amount of funding, see what happens over the next 2 months, but run them in parallel. Yeah, so I think the key thing is, you can't, this myth of rational decision-making, database decision-making is a problem. Substituting AI for that is going to make it worse, not better. Right? The issue is you need processes which allow you to gain perspective in the system.
Yeah. Yeah, I know I'm seeing quite a bit of work being done on listening, agile, and all of these concepts are all coming in, and they're just causing confusion in lots of cases. They're causing their own sets of complexity and chaos. Yeah. And it's just, I just wonder where organizations are going to end up. And then they say, well, we want to do some sort of optimization and transformation, and we've got all of these things in play.
I mean, I upset people. They say, oh, we all need to be servant leaders. And the answer is, no, we bloody don't. Sometimes we need to be servant leaders. Sometimes we need to be arrogant bastards. Yeah. It's this, I mean, it's interesting. It goes back, all right. It goes back. I call it the Billy Graham approach to management consulting. Right, which is going back to the Billy Graham rallies. Is what you're expected to do these days is you come to the tent and you're converted and you go behind the stage, and now you've got the religion. Yeah, and that's what most management consultancy methods are about. Is we've got the new salvation. Here is the Bible. Follow it. Become this, become that, do this. And to be quite honest, it's encouraging what I call positive cynicism. The way you survived in IBM is to work out what the current fashion was and just start to play the game for a bit.
Yeah.
And I remember actually when we got taken over by IBM, I remember going to a lot of the senior executives and saying, well, look, I've got a really good job. I'm in research. I can now do what the hell I want because I've got money, and provided to do interesting things. I'm the court jester, which is a role IBM had then, right? Didn't call it that, but that's what it was, right? And if you amused your boss and you upset all the people he didn't like, then you got promoted. So I worked that one, very well. I was good at that. And I said, what you all need to do is, first of all, don't wait for IBM, don't wait a year, because all IBM want to do is to monitor what's going on. Then the experienced politics will just grab the good bits and you'll be out of jobs. I said, become IBM tomorrow. Just, go home, take everything home, do your morning, come back in. And I said, employ somebody really senior, close to retirement in IBM as your number 2, and then they'll sort out the IBM processes for you. Yeah, because actually you'll get killed by the bureaucracy if you try and sort it out for yourself. You need somebody who knows how it works and knows which rules are really rules and has got all the personal networks. And I said, that will cost you $250,000 a year. And that's the price of survival. And I think that's the problem. If you look at most large corporations, when they lay off staff, they lay off the people doing work. They don't lay off the needless bureaucracy within the system.
And when they do that, they lose a lot of knowledge because all those people are taking the whys, the wheres, the whens, and the hows with them.
It's one of the things which went wrong with knowledge management. So people started to talk about the need to, I remember that somebody in HR told me once that, everybody, needed to have career progression. And these days you should expect to work for 2 or 3 years, then move somewhere else. And I said, that isn't a benefit. All right. And if you're saying this, then instead of gifting you my knowledge, I'll rent it to you. So if you're only giving me a job for 2 or 3 years, then you'll only get what you need for that job. You won't get anything else. And we moved people into this rental concept rather than gifting concept. Yeah, and that has also created problems. Interesting, the Japanese never did that. They kept lifetime employment for key employees because they knew the value of tacit knowledge and social relationships and interactions. And what we did with Six Sigma was to destroy effectively, I'll give you a metaphor. It's like we were only concerned with the trees, not the fungal roots which connected them. We thought that was inefficient. We could just put nitrogen in the soil and we wouldn't need them anymore. Yeah, and that's what companies have done. They've destroyed that ability to make decisions quickly in a crisis because they've destroyed the informal networks and the long-term experience and the deep knowledge.
Well, hopefully that's where the Cynefin framework will come in, and the work that you do, you know, will help shape that, because we've all got to be better at making decisions in complex, complicated and chaotic situations.
Yeah, it's an evolution. I mean, the danger is when you go through an evolutionary change, as I said earlier, is it's often first mover, not the right thing, which wins. So I say my worry about complexity is somebody will just pick it up, create an easy to adopt solution, and then we'll just get into the hype cycle again. And we've had enough of that for the past 3 decades.
But then we wear the implications of that, the results of doing that, don't we? And we don't know how long those results go for.
I think if I want to be positive about this, I think actually, I said the other day on a conference call, COVID is God's gift to humanity, because it's a manageable crisis, and we've got to learn how to cope with it because it's permanent now. And there are things coming, there are bacteria in the Siberian tundra, which God help us with the loss of antibiotic cures. Yeah. So there's worse things coming. So, and that's before we get into the emigration problem, as you know, whole areas around the equator become uninhabitable. You know, Singapore are working on having their whole population in air conditioning for 2 or 3 hours a day during the summer, because otherwise they won't live, because the temperature goes above the capacity of people to sweat. You're going to have that problem in Australia and elsewhere. So companies need to be creating resilience now, because they're not, this model which has worked for the past 30 years is to copy what was successful before, isn't going to work in the future. So the positive thing about this sort of stuff is companies who try that aren't going to last long anyway. Yeah. So the ability, and this is, you know, resilience, and I don't buy, I'm one of many people banned by the Taleb, all right? The Taleb blocks anybody who dares to disagree with him. I don't buy the anti-fragile concept, because for me, that's just one type of resilience. Yeah, resilience is the ability to survive with continuity of identity over time. So it's the ability to survive by changing and adapting. And actually, failure, you know, getting stronger through failure is a very limited case in that, and it's quite a dangerous one. And I think companies need to focus on resilience and sense making. Yeah, and those are kind of like the key focuses, because we're facing an uncertain future, and that means the last 30 years focus on efficiency is contraindicated, because efficient systems are not resilient. Yeah, they're over-optimized. So how do you build redundancy into your system for future states?
Yeah. Great points. Great points. Well, on that note, I think we're just about out of time. So I really appreciate the input from both of you, your experience, your sharing knowledge. It's been a great hour, and I think we've learned a lot, and I think people will pick up a lot of insight from what we've covered today. So thank you both.
It's a pleasure. Good talking with you.
Good talking to you too.